The harsh winter wind cut through Fairbrook, Colorado like a knife, as Fiona Davis clutched her shawl tighter around her thin shoulders, the meager protection doing little against the biting December cold of 1876. Her wooden cart, painted a cheerful yellow that had long since begun to chip and fade, held the last of her precious flowers' blooms she had carefully nurtured in the small greenhouse behind her modest homestead on the outskirts of town. Flowers. Fresh flowers. She called out, her voice nearly lost in the wind that whistled between the wooden buildings of Fairbrook's Main Street. Few people spared her more than a passing glance as they hurried about their business, bundled against the cold, minds focused on more practical concerns than flowers in winter. Fiona's fingers, red and chapped from the cold, arranged a cluster of delicate white and pink blooms. 23 years old and alone in the world save for the small plot of land her father had left her, she had turned to flowers to survive after his passing last spring. What had begun as her mother's hobby growing flowers even in the harshest weather had become Fiona's lifeline. How much? Came a deep voice from behind her. Startled, Fiona turned to find herself looking up into the face of a man she had never seen before. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble, he cut an imposing figure. His clothes, though dusty from the trail, were of good quality dark trousers, a blue shirt beneath a leather vest, and a weathered duster. A cowboy by the looks of him, though something about the way he carried himself suggested he was more than a simple ranch hand. 10 cents a bunch, sir, she replied, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. She had sold only 2 bunches all day, and the coins in her pocket weren't nearly enough for the supplies she needed. The stranger's eyes, a striking blue that reminded her of summer skies, studied her face for a long moment before dropping to the flowers in her cart. "How many bunches do you have left?" he asked, reaching into his pocket. Fiona quickly counted. 15, sir." To her astonishment, the man pulled out several coins and placed them in her palm. "I'll take them all." Fiona stared at the money far more than the $1.50 her flowers were worth. "Sir, this is fair price," he interrupted with a small smile that transformed his weathered face. "Winter's a hard time to grow anything, especially something as pretty as these." "Thank you, but I can't accept. Name's Matthew Blackburn," he said, ignoring her protest as he carefully gathered the flowers. "Just bought the old Wilson place east of town, planning to turn it into something worthwhile." Fiona found her voice. "Fiona Davis." "These flowers, what will you do with so many?" Matthew's smile deepened, revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "Got some ideas, but first I'd like to ask where you grow such fine blooms in the dead of winter." "I have a small greenhouse," she admitted. "My mother built it years ago." She loved flowers more than anything. Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, understanding, perhaps. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Fiona said softly. "She's been gone 5 years now. My father passed last spring." Matthew nodded, a respectful acknowledgement of her loss. "The greenhouse, is it enough? To get you through the winter, I mean?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. Pride made her want to assure him she was fine, but the truth was written clearly in her thin frame and worn clothing. "It helps," she said simply. Matthew glanced down at the flowers in his arms. "Miss Davis, I might have a proposition for you if you're willing to hear it." Fiona regarded him cautiously. She'd learned to be wary of propositions from men, especially strangers. But there was something in his steady gaze that didn't set off warnings. "What sort of proposition, Mr. Blackburn?" "The kind that involves flowers," he said. "And seeds. I'd like to see your greenhouse if you wouldn't mind showing it to me." "I've been thinking about starting something similar, and it seems you have expertise I could benefit from." Fiona hesitated. Inviting a stranger to her home went against everything she'd been taught, yet winter was only beginning and she was already struggling. "I close up at 4, she said finally. "If you'd like to come by then, I can show you." "I'd appreciate that," Matthew said, tipping his hat. "Until then, Miss Davis." As he walked away, arms full of her flowers, Fiona wondered if she had made a terrible mistake or if, Perhaps this stranger might somehow change the course of her difficult winter. At precisely 4 o'clock, Fiona closed her empty cart and began the walk home, pulling the wagon behind her through the dusting of snow that had begun to fall. She had just reached the small bridge that crossed Miller's Creek when the sound of hoofbeats approached from behind. "Miss Davis," Matthew called, slowing his chestnut gelding to a walk beside her. "Allow me to offer you a ride." Fiona looked up at him, then at her cart. "Thank you, Mr. Blackburn, but I couldn't leave my cart." "No need," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion. "We can secure it to my saddle. King here is strong enough to pull it without noticing." Before she could protest, Matthew had tied the cart's handle to his saddle with practiced efficiency. He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Fiona placed her gloved fingers in his. With surprising gentleness for such a large man, he helped her up onto his horse before mounting behind her. The ride to her small homestead took less than 15 minutes, but Fiona was acutely aware of every second of the solid warmth of the man behind her, of the way his arms created a protective barrier as he held the reins, of the faint scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to him. Her home came into view, a modest cabin with a stone chimney, beside which stood her pride and joy. A greenhouse made of glass panels set in a wooden frame, small but sturdy enough to withstand Colorado's harsh weather. Matthew drew the horse to a stop and dismounted before helping her down, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that Fiona could see flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "Your greenhouse," he said, stepping back and looking toward the glass structure that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. "It's impressive." Fiona felt a rush of pride. "My mother designed it. Father built it for her 10th wedding anniversary." "A fine gift," Matthew said, following as she led the way to the glass door. "Better than any jewelry." The moment they stepped inside, the difference was palpable. Warm, humid air replaced the winter chill, and the scent of earth and green things enveloped them. Rows of tables held an assortment of plants in various stages of growth, while hanging containers suspended from the ceiling held trailing vines and ferns. "This is remarkable," Matthew said, genuine admiration in his voice as he removed his hat. "How do you heat it?" "There's a small stove," Fiona explained, pointing to the corner where a cast iron stove stood, connected to a chimney pipe that ran through the roof. "And a system of water pipes beneath the tables that carry the heat. My father was quite ingenious with it." Matthew moved slowly through the greenhouse, examining the setup with obvious interest. "And these?" he asked, indicating a section where seedlings were just beginning to emerge from the soil. "Spring flowers," Fiona said. "I start them now so they'll be ready when the snow melts. I sell them to the general store and the hotel once they bloom." Matthew nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Miss Davis, I meant what I said earlier about a proposition." He turned to face her fully. "I bought the Wilson property with plans to start a ranch, but the land includes a good deal of fertile soil that's not being used. I've been thinking of diversifying, perhaps growing things that could supplement the cattle operation." Fiona watched him curiously. "What does this have to do with me?" "I'd like to build a greenhouse, a larger one, and grow flowers on a scale that could supply not just Fairbrook, but perhaps ship to Denver as well." His eyes met hers. "But I need someone who knows what they're doing, someone like you." Fiona's heart beat faster. "Are you offering me employment, Mr. Blackburn?" "A partnership," he corrected. "I have the land and the capital. You have the knowledge and the skill. Together, we could create something substantial, something that could weather any winter." Fiona walked to a nearby table, touching the petals of a red bloom as she considered his words. "Why flowers? Most men in your position would focus on cattle or perhaps crops." Matthew was quiet for a moment before answering. "My mother loved flowers. Back in Virginia before the war, she had gardens that people would travel miles to see." A shadow crossed his face. "When the war came, everything was destroyed. She never recovered from losing her gardens, died of grief, my father said, though the doctor called it consumption. Fiona's heart softened at the personal admission. I'm sorry for your loss. It was a long time ago, Matthew said, though his eyes suggested the wound wasn't fully healed. When I saw you today with your cart of flowers in the dead of winter. It reminded me of her stubborn determination to make beautiful things grow against all odds. The sincerity in his voice touched something in Fiona. Still, caution made her ask, How do I know you're trustworthy, Mr. Blackburn? I've known you less than a day. Matthew smiled slightly. You don't. But I can provide references from the bank in Denver and from Sheriff Taylor here in town. I'm not asking for an immediate answer. Think about it. Visit my property, see the potential for yourself. Fiona considered his offer. A partnership could mean security, a chance to expand beyond the precarious existence she'd been living. Yet it would also mean placing her trust in this stranger. I'll think about it, she said finally, and I would like to see your land. Tomorrow, he suggested. I could come by around noon if that suits you, Fiona nodded. That would be acceptable. As Matthew prepared to leave, he paused at the door of the greenhouse. I almost forgot to mention I've planted some of your flowers, planted them, but it's winter. His smile returned, warming his features. Not outside. I'm staying at the hotel until repairs on the house are complete. Thought my room could use some color. He hesitated before adding, and I saved the seeds. Every last one. Seems a shame to waste what might grow into something beautiful. With those words, he bid her good evening, leaving Fiona standing in her greenhouse with a strange feeling blossoming in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. That night, as the temperature dropped and snow began to fall in earnest, Fiona sat by her fireplace, weighing Matthew Blackburn's proposition. The practical side of her recognized the opportunity. It presented a chance to expand her flower business beyond what she could accomplish alone, with the security of a partner who had capital to invest. Yet another part of her remained wary. Men had come through Fairbrook before with grand schemes and promises, only to disappear when things grew difficult or a better opportunity arose. What guarantee did she have that Matthew Blackburn was different? Morning arrived with a blanket of fresh snow covering the landscape. Fiona rose early to tend to her greenhouse, checking the temperature and watering the delicate plants. Just before noon, the sound of hoofbeats announced Matthew's arrival. He appeared different today, clean-shaven, his dark hair neatly combed, dressed in a fresh shirt and coat. The transformation emphasized his handsome features, making him look younger and somehow more approachable. Miss Davis, he greeted her, removing his hat as she opened her door. I hope I'm not too early. Not at all, Mr. Blackburn, she replied, suddenly conscious of her simple blue dress and the practical boots she wore for working in the greenhouse. Would you care for some coffee before we depart? That would be most welcome, he said, stomping the snow from his boots before entering her small home. Fiona's cabin was modest but meticulously kept, with hand-sewn curtains at the windows and a few cherished possessions displayed on shelves: her mother's china teapot, a small collection of books, a wooden carving her father had made. As she prepared the coffee, Matthew studied a framed sketch on her wall, a detailed drawing of an elaborate garden design. Did you draw this? He asked. Fiona glanced over her shoulder. Yes, it's a design I've been working on, just a dream, really. Matthew examined it more closely. It's impressive. You have an eye for composition. He traced the lines with his finger, not touching the glass. This circular pattern here with the pathways radiating outward, it's almost like a wheel. A compass rose, Fiona corrected, bringing 2 cups of coffee to the small table. My father was a surveyor before he settled here. He taught me to appreciate good design. They sat across from each other, the small table making the moment feel unexpectedly intimate as they sipped their coffee. Tell me about your plans for the Wilson property, Fiona prompted. Matthew set his cup down. Wilson let the place go to ruin before he sold out. The house needs work and the fences need rebuilding, but the bones are good. The land is what matters: 300 acres with access to Miller's Creek for water. About 50 acres of good pasture for cattle, but there's also a southern-facing slope that gets full sun most of the day. Perfect for growing. And you want to build a greenhouse there. A series of them, eventually, Matthew said, his eyes lighting with enthusiasm. Start with one large enough to grow flowers commercially, then expand if it proves profitable. I've already ordered materials from Denver. Fiona raised her eyebrows. You seem very certain I'll agree to your proposition. Matthew's expression turned serious. Not certain, Miss Davis, hopeful. But the greenhouses will be built regardless. The question is whether they'll benefit from your expertise or whether I'll have to muddle through on my own. His honesty was refreshing. You're determined to grow flowers no matter what. I am, he confirmed. Though I'd prefer to succeed rather than fail spectacularly. A smile tugged at Fiona's lips despite her attempt to remain businesslike. And what exactly would this partnership entail? I assume you've thought about the specifics. I have, Matthew said, leaning forward slightly. I provide the land, materials for the greenhouses, and capital for equipment and supplies. You provide the knowledge and oversight for the flower operation. We split the profits equally. Fiona nearly choked on her coffee. Equally, but your investment is far greater. My financial investment, yes, Matthew acknowledged. But you'd be investing your time and expertise, which are equally valuable. I can replace money if the venture fails. You can't replace years of your life. His perspective surprised her. Most men would have offered her a wage, not an equal share. There's something else to consider, Matthew continued. Your greenhouse here, it's sufficient for your current operation, but what happens if we have a particularly harsh winter, or if something were to damage it? Fiona frowned. These were concerns that kept her awake on cold nights. I manage. You survive, Matthew corrected gently. There's a difference between surviving and thriving, Miss Davis. With multiple greenhouses, there would be security. If one fails, others remain. His words struck a chord. Since her father's death, Fiona had been surviving, getting by day to day, with little thought for the future beyond the next season. I'd still maintain my home here, she said, thinking aloud. I couldn't abandon it. Of course not, Matthew agreed quickly. I wouldn't expect you to. You could oversee both operations. It's only a 15-minute ride between the properties. Fiona sipped her coffee, considering. I would need to see your land before making any decision. That's why I'm here, Matthew said with a smile. My horse is saddled and ready whenever you are. The ride to the Wilson property took them through a stretch of pine forest, before opening onto rolling hills covered in snow. As they crested a rise, Fiona could see the layout of the land: a weathered 2-story farmhouse with a barn and several outbuildings in need of repair, surrounded by acres of open land that sloped gently toward a creek in the distance. There, Matthew said, pointing to a cleared area on the south-facing slope. That's where the first greenhouse would go. Good drainage, protected from the north winds by that stand of trees, and full sun most of the day. Fiona had to admit it was an ideal location, better even than where her own greenhouse stood. They dismounted, and Matthew led her on a tour of the property, pointing out his plans for each area. As they walked, Fiona found herself caught up in his vision, suggesting modifications and additions that he noted with serious consideration. What do you think? He asked finally as they stood on the slope where the greenhouse would be built. Fiona looked out over the property, imagining rows of flowers blooming in carefully planned beds, greenhouses gleaming in the sunlight. It was a beautiful vision, one that aligned remarkably well with dreams she had hardly dared to acknowledge. It has potential, she admitted. But starting such an operation in winter, it's not the ideal time. On the contrary, Matthew countered. Winter is the perfect time to build the structures and prepare. By spring, we could be ready to plant outside with seedlings already growing in the greenhouse. His optimism was infectious, but Fiona had learned to be cautious. What happens if it fails? If the flowers don't sell, or if the weather destroys everything? Matthew considered her question seriously. Then we adjust, try different flowers, look for new markets. That's the advantage of a partnership, two minds working on solutions instead of one. They walked back toward the house, which stood solid despite its need for repair. On the porch, Matthew stopped and turned to her. "Miss Davis, Fiona, if I may, I'm not asking for blind faith. Come to town with me tomorrow, speak with Mr. Hawkins at the bank. He'll confirm my financial standing. Talk to Sheriff Taylor about my character. I've nothing to hide." The use of her given name should have felt presumptuous, but somehow it didn't. "That would be prudent," she agreed. "A partnership requires trust." "Indeed it does," Matthew said, "and trust must be earned." As they rode back to her cabin, Fiona found herself studying Matthew's profile against the winter sky. There was a steadiness to him that she found reassuring, none of the bluster or false promises she'd encountered in other men who had passed through Fairbrook. "May I ask what brought you to Colorado?" she inquired. "You mentioned Virginia before." Matthew was quiet for a moment before answering. "After the war, there wasn't much left for me in Virginia. My family's land was gone, my parents were dead, and too many memories haunted the place." He glanced at her. "I headed west, worked cattle drives in Texas, then as a foreman on a ranch near Denver. Saved everything I earned, looking for the right opportunity. When I heard the Wilson place was for sale, it felt like the time had come to put down roots again. And you chose flowers as part of that new beginning." A small smile softened his features. "Seems fitting, doesn't it? Something new growing from the ashes of the past." The poetic sentiment surprised her. This man continued to defy her expectations. When they reached her cabin, Matthew helped her down from his horse, his hands strong and warm at her waist. For a brief moment they stood close, and Fiona was struck by a sudden awareness of him not as a potential business partner, but as a man. "Thank you for showing me your property," she said, stepping back, "and for considering me for this partnership." "The thanks is mine," Matthew replied, "for your willingness to consider it." He hesitated before adding, "Regardless of your decision about the partnership, I'd be honored if you would join me for supper tomorrow evening. After you've had a chance to speak with Mr. Hawkins and the sheriff, of course." Fiona hadn't dined out since her father's passing, couldn't afford such luxuries, but the invitation was tempting for reasons that went beyond a simple meal. "I would like that," she said finally. Matthew's smile broadened. "Excellent. Shall I call for you at 6? "6 would be fine," Fiona agreed, suddenly conscious of the worn state of her best dress. "Would it be presentable enough for a supper in town?" As if reading her thoughts, Matthew added, "There's a new seamstress in town, Mrs. Winters. She mentioned to me just yesterday that she's looking for fresh flowers for her shop window. Perhaps you might pay her a visit tomorrow with some of your blooms." The suggestion was made casually, but Fiona recognized it for what it was, a tactful way of helping her earn money for whatever she might need without making her feel like a charity case. "That's kind of you to mention," she said. "I believe I will visit her." Matthew tipped his hat. "Until tomorrow, Miss Davis." As she watched him ride away, Fiona realized she was genuinely looking forward to the next day, the first time since her father's death that she'd felt anticipation instead of dread when thinking about the future. The following morning dawned bright and cold, with sunlight sparkling on the fresh snow. Fiona rose early, as always, to tend to her greenhouse before preparing for her trip to town. She selected her finest blooms, white roses, pink carnations, and delicate ferns, arranging them in a basket lined with moss to keep them fresh. In town, she visited Mrs. Winters' shop first, where the seamstress was delighted with the flowers and paid generously for them, even requesting a standing order for fresh blooms twice weekly. With coins jingling in her pocket, Fiona continued to the bank, where Mr. Hawkins confirmed everything Matthew had told her about his financial situation, and then some. "Mr. Blackburn has substantial capital invested," the banker told her. "He's a prudent businessman with a solid plan for the Wilson property. If he's proposing a partnership with you, Miss Davis, I'd consider it a fine opportunity." Sheriff Taylor was equally positive when she casually inquired about the newcomer. "Blackburn's a straight shooter," the sheriff said. "Helped break up a fight at the saloon his second night in town, then paid for the damages even though he wasn't involved. Says a lot about a man's character." With these reassurances bolstering her confidence, Fiona visited the general store where she purchased fabric for a new collar and cuffs to refresh her best dress. By the time she returned home, she had enough time to make the alterations before preparing for supper. At precisely 6 o'clock, the sound of a wagon approaching her cabin announced Matthew's arrival. When she opened the door, she found him standing on her porch in a dark suit, his hat in his hands, looking remarkably handsome. "Miss Davis," he greeted her, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. Her dark blue dress with its freshly added white collar and cuffs was simple but flattering. "You look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Blackburn," she replied, feeling a blush warm her cheeks as she reached for her shawl. Matthew stepped forward. "Allow me," he said, taking the shawl and gently placing it around her shoulders. The simple gesture felt surprisingly intimate. The hotel dining room was busy when they arrived, but the proprietor, Mr. Jensen, had reserved a table by the window. Fiona was acutely aware of the glances they received as Matthew helped her into her chair, a newcomer. And a local woman dining together was bound to cause speculation in a small town like Fairbrook. "I hope you don't mind being the subject of town gossip," Matthew said quietly as he took his seat across from her, proving he was as observant as she was. "It's inevitable in a place this size," Fiona replied with a small smile, "though I suspect you'll be the more interesting subject." The mysterious Mr. Blackburn from Virginia, buying the Wilson property and planning to grow flowers. Matthew chuckled. "I'm hardly mysterious, just a man looking to start fresh." "With flowers," Fiona added, "you must admit that's unusual for a cattle rancher." "Perhaps," Matthew conceded. "But why limit oneself to convention? Besides, I suspect there's more profit in flowers than most people realize, especially when grown by someone with your talent." As they dined on roast beef and potatoes, their conversation flowed easily from business to personal matters. Fiona found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Fairbrook, of her mother's passion for flowers and her father's steady presence. "And you never wanted to leave?" Matthew asked. "See other places?" Fiona considered the question. "I did once. I dreamed of going to San Francisco. They say the gardens there are magnificent. But after Mother died, Father needed me, and then—" She trailed off, the familiar ache of loss momentarily stealing her words. "And then you were alone," Matthew finished gently. Fiona nodded. "With responsibilities. The land, the house, the greenhouse, I couldn't leave it all behind." "You honored your parents by preserving what they built," Matthew said. "That takes courage." No one had ever described her choice to stay as courageous before. Most saw it as the only option for a woman alone, or worse, as a failure of imagination. "What about you?" she asked. "After all your travels, why choose Fairbrook to settle?" Matthew's eyes met hers. "I wasn't looking for Fairbrook specifically. I was looking for the right place, somewhere with good land, water, and potential. Somewhere that could become home." He paused. "When I crested that hill and saw the valley spread out below, with the mountains in the distance and the creek winding through, it felt right. Like a place where new things could grow." The simple honesty of his answer touched her. As they finished their meal with apple pie and coffee, Matthew brought the conversation back to business. "Have you had a chance to consider my proposition?" he asked. "I understand if you need more time." Fiona set down her coffee cup. "I've spoken with Mr. Hawkins and Sheriff Taylor. They both speak highly of you. I'm glad to hear it. I've also had time to consider the practical aspects," she continued. "Your location is ideal for growing. The arrangement you've proposed is fair, more than fair, actually." She took a deep breath. "I would like to accept your offer of partnership, Mr. Blackburn." Matthew's face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his features. "That's excellent news, Miss Davis, truly excellent." He extended his hand across the table. "Partners, then?" Fiona placed her hand in his. "Partners." His hand was warm around hers, calloused from work but gentle in its grip. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Fiona was aware of something shifting between them, a connection forming that went beyond business. "I believe this calls for a celebration," Matthew said, releasing her hand and signaling to the waiter. "Would you care for a glass of wine?" The evening continued pleasantly, with the formality of their earlier interactions gradually giving way to a more comfortable rapport. By the time Matthew drove her home, the stars were bright in the clear winter sky, and Fiona felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. At her door, Matthew helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering slightly at her waist. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Fiona said, suddenly shy. "The pleasure was mine," Matthew replied. "I'll begin work on the greenhouse tomorrow." "Would you be willing to review the plans before we start building?" "Of course. I can come by in the afternoon." Matthew nodded. "Until tomorrow, then." He hesitated, then added, "I'm very glad you've agreed to this partnership, Fiona. I believe we're going to create something remarkable together." As she watched him drive away, Fiona couldn't help but wonder if he was referring solely to their business venture or to something more. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Matthew began construction on the first greenhouse immediately, hiring local men for the labor and incorporating Fiona's suggestions into the design. The structure took shape rapidly larger than her own greenhouse, with an improved heating system and better ventilation. While the men worked on construction, Fiona divided her time between caring for her own plants and planning for the new operation. She created detailed planting schedules, lists of seeds and bulbs to order, and designs for the outdoor gardens that would be planted in spring. Matthew proved to be a dedicated worker and a thoughtful partner, valuing her input and defending her decisions when one of the workers questioned taking orders from a woman. "Miss Davis is the expert here," he had said firmly. "Her word on matters of the greenhouse is final." As they worked side by side, Fiona found herself increasingly drawn to Matthew. It wasn't just his handsome appearance or his kindness, though both were appealing. It was the way he approached challenges with calm determination, the respect he showed for her knowledge, and the care he took with every aspect of their shared venture. By mid-January, the greenhouse was complete, and they celebrated by planting the first seedlings to gather varieties that would bloom in early spring and provide their first commercial harvest. "To new beginnings," Matthew said, standing beside her as they surveyed their work at the end of the day. The setting sun cast a golden glow through the glass, illuminating the newly turned soil in the planting beds. "To new beginnings," Fiona echoed, acutely aware of his presence beside her, solid and reassuring. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Matthew said, turning to face her. "The repairs on the house are nearly finished, and I'll be moving in next week. I was hoping you might join me for supper that evening, the first meal in my new home." The invitation felt significantly different from their occasional meals at the hotel or the simple lunches they shared while working. "I'd be honored," Fiona said, her heart beating a little faster. Matthew's smile warmed his eyes. "Good, that's good." A comfortable silence fell between them as they walked back toward where his horse was tethered. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes catching in Fiona's hair and on her eyelashes. Matthew reached out, gently brushing a snowflake from her cheek. The touch was brief, but sent warmth spreading through her despite the cold. "You should get home before the snow worsens," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Yes," she agreed, though part of her was reluctant to end their time together. As had become their routine, Matthew helped her onto his horse before mounting behind her for the ride to her cabin. The physical closeness that had once made her nervous now felt natural, comforting. Even at her door, he lingered longer than usual, seemingly reluctant to leave. "Fiona," he began, then hesitated. "Yes," she prompted when he didn't continue. Matthew looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I want you to know that this partnership, it's become very important to me, not just the business, but working with you." Fiona's heart raced at his words and the meaning behind them. "It's important to me too, Matthew." His name felt right on her lips, intimate and true. Something shifted in his expression at her use of it, his eyes softening. "Good night, Fiona," he said finally, reaching out to briefly touch her hand before turning to go. "Good night, Matthew," she replied, watching as he rode away into the gently falling snow. Inside her cabin, Fiona leaned against the closed door, a smile curving her lips. Something was growing between them, something as promising as the seedlings they had planted together. Like those tender plants, it needed time and care to flourish, but the potential was undeniably there. The next week brought heavy snowfall that temporarily halted work on the outdoor preparations at the property. Instead, Matthew focused on finishing the interior of the house while Fiona tended to both greenhouses, moving carefully between them despite the deep snow. On the evening of Matthew's house warming supper, the sky cleared, revealing a brilliant canopy of stars. Matthew arrived at Fiona's cabin with a borrowed sleigh, the bells on the harness jingling merrily in the crisp air. Fiona had spent extra time on her appearance, wearing her best dress with a shawl her mother had embroidered with tiny flowers. When Matthew saw her, the appreciation in his eyes made the effort worthwhile. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, accepting his hand as she stepped into the sleigh. "You're quite handsome yourself." Indeed he was, dressed in a dark suit with a white shirt and blue tie that matched his eyes. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved for the occasion, highlighting the strong line of his jaw. The sleigh ride was magical, gliding over the snow-covered landscape beneath the stars, wrapped in warm blankets, with Matthew's solid presence beside her. When they arrived at the house, Fiona was charmed by the transformation. The once neglected building now stood proudly against the night sky, windows glowing with warm light, a wreath of evergreens on the front door. Inside, Matthew had prepared everything perfectly. A fire crackled in the hearth of the cozy sitting room, and the dining table was set with care, nothing fancy but thoughtfully arranged. The delicious aroma of roasting chicken filled the house. "You cooked?" Fiona asked, surprised. "Don't sound so astonished," Matthew chuckled. "I lived alone for years before coming to Fairbrook. A man can't survive on saloon food forever." As he took her shawl, his fingers brushed her shoulders, sending a pleasant shiver down her spine. The moment felt intimate in a way their previous encounters hadn't. They were alone in his home, away from the curious eyes of the townspeople. "Would you like a tour before we eat?" he offered. The house was simply furnished but comfortable, with sturdy, practical pieces that suited Matthew's straightforward nature. What caught Fiona's attention, however, were the small personal touches throughout: framed sketches of flowers on the walls, books stacked neatly on shelves, and a vase of winter blooms on the mantel. "Are those from my cart?" she asked, recognizing some of the preserved flowers he had purchased on the day they met. "They are," Matthew confirmed. "They've lasted remarkably well." "You dried them," Fiona observed, touching a petal gently. "Properly, with the stems hanging upside down." "I watched my mother do it countless times," Matthew said. "Some things you don't forget." The supper was delicious: roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread from the town bakery, and a bottle of wine that Matthew had been saving for a special occasion. "To our partnership," he toasted, raising his glass. "To partnership," Fiona echoed, though the words seemed inadequate for what was developing between them. Their conversation flowed easily as they ate, touching on their plans for the spring planting, the first flowers they would send to Denver, and their hopes for the business. Yet beneath the practical discussion ran a current of something deeper: shared glances, lingering smiles, the occasional brush of hands as they passed serving dishes. After the meal, they moved to the sitting room, where Matthew added a log to the fire before joining Fiona on the small sofa. The crackle of the flames and the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel were the only sounds in the comfortable silence that settled between them. "I have something for you," Matthew said eventually, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "A small token to mark our partnership." Fiona accepted the package, untying the string carefully. Inside was a journal bound in soft leather, its pages crisp and blank, waiting to be filled. "For your garden designs and planting records," Matthew explained. "I noticed you using scraps of paper and the margins of almanacs. I thought you might appreciate something more substantial." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. "Matthew, it's perfect, thank you." "There's an inscription," he said, his voice quieter than before. Fiona opened the cover to find his neat handwriting on the first page. "To Fiona, whose knowledge makes things grow. May our partnership flourish like your flowers. With admiration, Matthew, it's beautiful," she said, genuinely moved by the sentiment. "I meant every word," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. Later, Fiona would never be certain who moved first, only that suddenly the space between them had vanished, and Matthew's lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with growing passion as she responded to his kiss. When they finally parted, Matthew rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "Fiona," he whispered, her name a caress on his lips. "I've wanted to do that since the day I watched you arranging flowers in your cart." Fiona smiled, her hand resting against his chest where she could feel the strong beating of his heart. "I've wanted you to," she admitted, "for longer than I was willing to acknowledge." Matthew drew back slightly to look into her eyes. "I need you to know this partnership, the greenhouse, the flowers, they're all important to me, but not nearly as important as you've become." The raw honesty in his voice and the vulnerability in his eyes told Fiona everything she needed to know. This was no passing fancy, no casual dalliance. What was growing between them was as real and promising as the seedlings taking root in their greenhouse. "I feel the same," she said softly. Matthew's smile was radiant as he leaned in to kiss her again, his arms drawing her closer in a protective embrace that felt like coming home. As the winter progressed, Fiona and Matthew fell into a comfortable routine. Their days were filled with work tending the greenhouse, ordering supplies for spring, and preparing the ground for outdoor planting as weather permitted. Their evenings were increasingly spent together, sharing meals, making plans, and discovering the joy of simply being in each other's company. By February, their first greenhouse was thriving, with early spring flowers beginning to bloom. Fiona had implemented a forcing technique that allowed them to have blooms weeks ahead of the natural season, and Matthew had established contacts in Denver, eager to purchase their flowers at premium prices. Their personal relationship deepened alongside their business success. Matthew was attentive and respectful, never pushing for more than Fiona was ready to give, yet making his feelings abundantly clear through countless small gestures: a flower left on her workbench, a warm hand at the small of her back, the tender way he kissed her goodbye each evening. For Fiona, who had resigned herself to a solitary life after her father's death, Matthew's presence was a revelation. She found herself looking forward to the future in a way she hadn't for years, imagining possibilities that extended far beyond mere survival. In mid-February, a violent snowstorm hit Fairbrook, burying the town under several feet of snow and making travel between properties nearly impossible. Concerned about Fiona's greenhouse, Matthew fought his way through the drifts on horseback, arriving at her cabin exhausted and half-frozen. "Matthew," Fiona cried when she opened the door to find him on her porch, snow coating his hat and shoulders. "What are you doing here? It's dangerous to be out in this weather." "Your greenhouse," he said through chattering teeth. "I was worried about the stove going out." Fiona pulled him inside, helping him remove his ice-encrusted coat and gloves. "The greenhouse is fine. I banked the stove before the worst of the storm hit." She pressed a cup of hot coffee into his hands. You could have frozen to death coming here in this weather." Matthew's blue eyes met hers over the rim of the cup. "It was worth the risk. I couldn't bear the thought of you losing what you've worked so hard to build." The simple statement, delivered without drama or expectation, crystallized something in Fiona's heart. This man, this good, steadfast man, had risked his safety for her dreams, not because he expected anything in return, but because he cared. "You're not going back in this weather," she said firmly. "You'll stay here until the storm passes." Matthew hesitated. "Fiona, your reputation is less important than your life," she finished. "Besides, everyone in town knows we're business partners. There's nothing improper about you sheltering here during a blizzard." The storm raged for 2 days, during which Fiona and Matthew existed in a domestic harmony that felt both novel and strangely familiar. They cooked together, tended the greenhouse, and spent long evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing: their childhoods, their hopes for the future, their shared vision for the flower business. On the second night, as they sat side by side on the small sofa, Matthew took her hand in his expression serious. "Fiona, there's something I need to say." Her heart quickened at his tone. "What is it?" Matthew turned to face her fully. "These past weeks have been the happiest of my life. Working with you, building something together, it's more than I ever hoped to find when I came to Fairbrook." He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I know it hasn't been long, but some things you just know, deep in your bones." Fiona's breath caught as Matthew slid from the sofa to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. "I love you, Fiona Davis. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. I love the way you nurture every living thing around you. I love watching you work with the flowers, seeing your face light up when a new bloom opens." His voice grew husky with emotion. "I came to Fairbrook looking for a place to put down roots, but I found something far more precious. I found you." Tears welled in Fiona's eyes as Matthew continued. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer. I know this might seem sudden, but I want you to know my intentions, that I hope someday when you're ready, you might consider becoming my wife. Not just my business partner, but my life partner." For a moment, Fiona couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion his words had stirred. When she found her voice, it was steady despite her tears. "Matthew Blackburn, you came into my life on the coldest day of winter and brought with you the promise of spring." She reached out to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "I don't need time to consider. I love you, and nothing would make me happier than to be your wife." The joy that blazed across Matthew's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He rose, pulling her to her feet and into his arms, his kiss conveying all the love and promise his words had expressed. When they parted, both breathless, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "When the road's clear, I'll go into town and speak with Reverend Collins." "Would you consider a spring wedding? When the first outdoor flowers bloom?" Fiona smiled up at him. "That sounds perfect." The following morning, they awoke to find the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Matthew reluctantly prepared to return to his property, needing to check on the animals and the greenhouse there. At the door, he kissed her thoroughly before donning his hat. "I'll be back tomorrow, weather permitting, and I'll speak to Reverend Collins when I go into town for supplies." Fiona nodded, already missing him though he hadn't yet left. "Be careful on the roads, the drifts will be deep." "I will," he promised, stealing one more kiss before stepping out into the brilliant winter sunshine. Fiona watched until he disappeared over the hill, her heart full to bursting with a happiness she had never expected to find. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Fairbrook, met with general approval and only a few raised eyebrows at the speed of their courtship. Mr. Hawkins at the bank was particularly pleased, mentioning to anyone who would listen that he had known from the start that the partnership between Miss Davis and Mr. Blackburn would be advantageous for all involved. As February gave way to March, signs of the approaching spring began to appear. The snow started to recede from south-facing slopes, revealing patches of earth eager for the sun's warming rays. In the greenhouse, their early plantings thrived, producing blooms that were shipped to Denver twice weekly, returning handsome profits that were reinvested in the business. With Matthew's encouragement, Fiona expanded her vision for their flower operation. No longer focused solely on survival, she designed elaborate garden plans that would transform the sloping land below the greenhouse into a showpiece of color and fragrance come summer. People could visit, she explained one evening as they reviewed her designs spread across Matthew's dining table. Not just to buy flowers, but to see the gardens themselves. In Denver and back east, public gardens charge admission. We could do the same once everything is established. Matthew studied the intricate layouts with admiration. It's brilliant, creating not just a business but a destination. He looked up at her, blue eyes warm with pride. "You're remarkable, you know that," Fiona blushed at his praise. "I'm just building on what my mother taught me." "You're doing far more than that," Matthew insisted. "You're creating something entirely new, something that could put Fairbrook on the map for more than just being a stop on the way to the mining towns." His belief in her vision bolstered Fiona's confidence. With each passing day, she found herself thinking bigger, dreaming larger, no longer constrained by the boundaries of mere survival. As their wedding day approached, preparations intensified both for the ceremony and for the spring planting. The date was set for mid-April, when the first daffodils and tulips would be blooming in the outdoor beds they had prepared. 2 weeks before the wedding, Matthew surprised Fiona by taking her to the small clearing behind the main greenhouse, where a new structure stood, covered with canvas. "What's this?" she asked, curious. Matthew's eyes twinkled with excitement. "A wedding gift, something I've been working on in the evenings." With a flourish, he pulled away the canvas to reveal a small glass structure, not a greenhouse, but a garden pavilion, its frame more delicate than their working greenhouses, with decorative elements that gave it an elegant appearance. "Matthew," Fiona breathed, stepping forward to examine the beautiful creation. "It's exquisite. It's for us," he explained, taking her hand and leading her inside. "A place to sit among the flowers even when the weather doesn't cooperate. And perhaps," he added with a smile, "a place to host our wedding if the April weather proves unpredictable." Fiona turned in a slow circle, taking in the details: the small benches built into the walls, the hooks for hanging plants, the clever ventilation system that would keep it comfortable in various weather conditions. "You built this yourself?" she asked, noting the fine craftsmanship. "With some help from Tom Jenkins for the glass work," Matthew admitted. "But yes, mostly myself. I wanted it to be special." Fiona threw her arms around his neck, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's perfect, absolutely perfect." As Matthew held her close, Fiona reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken in just a few months. From selling flowers to survive the winter to planning a wedding and a future with a man who not only supported her dreams, but expanded them with his own vision and care. The week of the wedding arrived with perfect spring weather, warm days, cool nights, and a riot of color beginning to emerge in their carefully tended gardens. Flowers from their greenhouse adorned the small church in town, transforming the simple space into a fragrant bower that had the townsfolk exclaiming in appreciation. On her wedding morning, Fiona stood in her bedroom, looking at her reflection in the mirror. Her wedding dress was simple but lovely, cream-colored with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, work she had done herself during the long winter evenings. Her mother's locket hung around her neck, containing tiny pressed flowers instead of portraits, a connection to the woman who had taught her to love growing things. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Mrs. Jensen, the hotel proprietor's wife, who had kindly offered to help Fiona prepare for the ceremony. "Oh, my dear," the older woman said, hands clasped to her chest. "You look absolutely beautiful. Mr. Blackburn is going to be speechless." Fiona smiled, a blend of nervousness and joy fluttering in her stomach. "I hope so." As Mrs. Jensen helped arrange the small wreath of fresh flowers in Fiona's hair, she spoke of her own marriage of 30 years. "The secret is to grow together," she advised. "Like two trees planted close separate, but entwined, supporting each other through all seasons." The metaphor struck Fiona as particularly apt for her relationship with Matthew, two people with their own strengths, coming together to create something stronger than either could achieve alone. The church was filled to capacity when Fiona arrived. Though she had no family to give her away, Sheriff Taylor had gallantly offered to escort her down the aisle. As the small organ began to play and the church doors opened, Fiona's eyes immediately found Matthew waiting at the altar. He stood tall and handsome in his new suit, his face transforming with wonder as he saw her. The look in his eyes as she walked toward him, a mixture of love, pride, and absolute certainty, calmed any lingering nerves she might have felt. Reverend Collins spoke of love and partnership, of nurturing and growth, themes that resonated deeply with both Fiona and Matthew. When the time came to exchange vows, Matthew's voice was steady and sure as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her all the days of his life. When Fiona spoke her vows in return, she added her own words. "I promise to grow with you through all seasons, to weather whatever storms may come, and to find joy in each new day we share." The kiss they shared after being pronounced husband and wife was sweet with promise, the beginning of a life together that both knew would be rich with challenges and rewards. The celebration afterward was held in their garden, where tables had been set up among the early spring blooms. The townsfolk of Fairbrook mingled with the workers from the property, and the business contacts Matthew had made in Denver, all united in wishing the couple well. As evening approached and the celebration continued, Matthew drew Fiona aside to the glass pavilion he had built, now illuminated with lanterns that cast a warm glow over the intimate space. "Happy, Mrs. Blackburn?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Fiona leaned back against his chest, looking out at the gathering of people who had come to celebrate with them. "More than I ever imagined possible," she said truthfully. Matthew's lips brushed her temple. "Do you remember the day we met, when I bought all your flowers?" "Of course," Fiona replied. "You paid far too much for them." "Best investment I ever made," Matthew chuckled, turning her in his arms to face him. "I kept the seeds from those flowers, planted them in that special soil mix you recommended." "Did they grow?" Fiona asked, curious. Matthew nodded, his eyes warm with meaning. "They're just beginning to bloom in the small plot behind our house. I thought perhaps—" He hesitated, suddenly looking unexpectedly shy. "I thought perhaps they might be the beginning of a garden for our children someday. A place where they could learn about growing things, as you did with your mother." Fiona's heart swelled with love for this man who thought not just of their present happiness, but of the legacy they might create together. "That's a beautiful idea," she said, reaching up to touch his face. "Our children will have gardens full of flowers and hearts full of love. And parents who will teach them that even in the harshest winter, new life is preparing to emerge," Matthew added, drawing her closer. "That with care and patience, beautiful things can grow in the most unlikely circumstances." As he lowered his lips to hers in a tender kiss, Fiona knew with absolute certainty that what they had created together, their business, their home, their love, would continue to flourish through all the seasons of their lives. In the years that followed, the Blackburn flower business became renowned throughout Colorado and beyond. Their gardens expanded to include not just flowers for cutting and shipping, but display gardens that attracted visitors from as far away as San Francisco and Chicago. The glass pavilion Matthew had built as a wedding gift became the centerpiece of these gardens, expanded over time to include a small cafe where visitors could enjoy refreshments surrounded by seasonal blooms. 3 years after their wedding, Fiona gave birth to their first child, a son they named James, after Matthew's father. 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they called Rose, in honor of the flowers that had brought them together. Both children grew up with soil beneath their fingernails and a deep appreciation for growing things, helping in the greenhouses from the time they could toddle. Fiona's small, original greenhouse remained in operation, serving as a laboratory of sorts where she experimented with new varieties and growing techniques. The cabin where she had once struggled to survive the winter became a cozy guest house for visitors to the gardens. On the 10th anniversary of the day they met, Matthew surprised Fiona with a special addition to their gardens, a small bronze plaque mounted beside a circular bed of the same varieties of flowers she had been selling from her cart on that cold winter day. The plaque reads simply, "From these flowers, a life bloomed. Matthew and Fiona Blackburn, January 1877." Standing beside the memorial, Fiona leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching their children play among the blooms that had flourished from seeds saved so long ago. "Did you ever imagine that day in town that buying my flowers would lead to all this?" she asked, gesturing to the expanse of colorful gardens bustling with visitors. Matthew's arm tightened around her waist as he pressed a kiss to her temple, now touched with a few strands of silver among the brown. "I hoped," he said simply. "Sometimes, Fiona, that's all it takes, a hope and the courage to nurture it through the cold." As they walked hand in hand through the gardens they had created together, surrounded by the beauty they had coaxed from the earth through dedication and love, both knew they had built something far more precious than a successful business. They had created a legacy of growth and renewal, proof that even in the darkest winter, spring's promise waited beneath the surface, needing only care and faith to flourish into something beautiful beyond imagining.